Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be talking about the International Booker Prize shortlist for 2023. And so I finally now got to the point where I've finished reading the entire long list. And I kind of wanted to, I was planning on reading the entire long list anyway, but I kind of wanted to finish reading the entire long list before I started really going in on the shortlist as a whole and kind of evaluating it as a whole. Because I kind of wanted to see sort of, you know, what books had made it, what hadn't, and kind of get a general sense for what had been in the judges' minds when they picked the long list of, you know, were there particular themes, were there things that they were looking for. And yeah, I mean, sort of just in terms of how this is going to look, I'm going to talk a little bit about the long list first, then I'm going to go into talking about the short list as a whole, and kind of my thoughts on it. And then hopefully from there, picking my hopeful winners. We shall see. Prizes don't always work out the way you want them to, but let's see. So let's start off with the long list. So the 13 books for the long list were announced a couple of months ago now, which feels like a very long time ago now, actually. And it was, you know, I suppose, to be honest, a surprise for many people. I think there were lots of big books that did make it, that people were expecting, and they were in the list. There were a few books that made it onto the list that people hadn't been expecting to see, and in some cases hadn't heard of, and in some cases as well hadn't been released yet. And then there were also some sort of books that people were really expecting to see on that long list that didn't make it. And so it's been a really interesting one, you know. Just, you know, obviously, again, it's worth noting right from the beginning here, prizes are a group of often around 5 people sitting and reading 100 and something books. I think it's about 90 or 100 or something like that for the International Booker. And from those, drawing a list of 13 that they have as their long list. And it's worth noting that obviously that choice of 13 is going to be largely a consensus-based decision on the 5 judges getting around and thinking about the books that they all read together. But it's also a little bit of a wider conversation around what books were actually submitted, because sometimes the books that you expect to be there aren't there, and sometimes that's because the judges didn't put it through. Sometimes it's because actually the publishers didn't send it. So it's always up in the air and we can never quite be sure. The only people who really know this are the 5 judges themselves. So that is kind of a starting point, I guess, for a lot of this. But I think it was worth noting that long list was a real surprise for a lot of people. And as I read through it, again, you're not obviously going to enjoy all of the books on a long list. There are a fair few that I really enjoyed, many of which didn't make the short list. So actually my ideal short list would have looked a little different. I think 3 or 4 of the books that did make the shortlist I'm very, very happy with. And I would have maybe had a few others in there. So Birthday Party by Laurent Mevignier is one that I would have definitely put on the shortlist personally. Something like Is Mother Dead by Vigdis Hjorth, I think could have been a really interesting addition. There are other books I really enjoyed as well. Paya by Purvel Mangangran. There were a few other just like releases on that list that I thought were really interesting. While We Were Dreaming, I thought was really interesting. So as a general long list, people have sort of pointed out that themes around motherhood and being parents really dominated a large part of the long list. So quite a few books like Is Mother Dead, obviously the title suggests, deals with this idea of motherhood. We've also got a few books that did then make the shortlist. So Boulder, we've also got Stillborn, which I've got here, and a few other books as well that kind of dabble with it to some degree. So A System So Magnificent It Is Blinding, which also deals a lot with sort of family dynamics. And to some degree that's to be expected. Family dynamics are a core part of the art that humans make and the stories we tell and all those sorts of things. That's to be expected. But I think to see so much of it, particularly around motherhood in this long list, was quite interesting. And so overall, I think it was a somewhat strong long list. There were a few in that I completely, some that I struggled with massively, some that I just sort of was like, okay, you know, they're there. And, you know, they're not my cup of tea, but I'm sure somebody else would really enjoy them. And so that's kind of how I approached the long list, of a few that I was like, okay, yeah, cool, whatever. But then also a few books that I'm really, really glad it introduced me to, because they are books that I have had this really beautiful reading experience with. So something like The Birthday Party, which for me was such a staggering read, that I'm just really excited I was sort of prompted to go and take it away and read it because of this prize list. And it's worth noting that's kind of the job of a prize list, although ostensibly there's this one winner, and the idea of the winner is to, you know, champion some of the best writing out there. In the meantime, in the process around that, we are exposed to so many other books and so many other conversations, not only the long list, but also the whole conversation around what books didn't make it, and therefore maybe you should still go and check these things out. So even if one year has a quote unquote rubbish long list, I'm not saying this one is, but I mean, I don't think it's the strongest, but like, you know, even if one year has a particularly weak long list, that doesn't mean that it's been a wasted endeavor, nonetheless. So anyway, with that in mind, let's get started on going into the shortlist one by one, and I'll take the authors' names in by alphabetical order. First up in alphabetical order, and I won't be going into spoilers for these, so please don't worry, this is more of an overview. The first is Boulder by Eva Baltasar and translated by Julia Sanches from the Catalan. And I really love this book. I've done a separate review of it. I went on at length about how much I adore this book. But for a book that is around 100 pages long, it really does a lot. I think it has this really interesting discussion at the heart of it around motherhood, and particularly how much you would go towards having children to please your partner. And that in some ways undersells what this book does, because I think really at the heart of it is a very clever unpicking of a very complicated relationship. We've got Boulder, who herself, the sort of titular character, who in many ways feels like she's given up a lot on life. There are a few things around her that she could kind of be part of if she wanted to. You know, she's moved to a new place, and instead of being particularly excited about this world, she's mostly alienated by it. And there's a chance for her to meet another Spanish speaker, and she is frustrated that she feels that she's just being thrown in with somebody just based on language, and maybe she doesn't have anything to do with this anything in common with this person. But I think what's really clever at the heart of it is that this book just really examines what that can look like. We have moments of her paranoia about things in the relationship, and we in many ways follow her on that journey of thinking at times that she's absolutely right and that these things are definitely happening, and at other times thinking that maybe she's reading too much into a situation. And the discussions that she then has around what it then looks like when she has a child is suddenly in front of her in this relationship is a very strange thing for her, of how she then navigates a very difficult conversation of, you know, now to leave her partner also means leaving a kid. But she didn't really want the kid, and she doesn't really love her partner. So actually, does that matter? And then, you know, the questions that she has for herself around cheating, and whether that is acceptable when her partner is sort of in the midst of the midst of thinking about childbirth and childcare and all these other things. Is it then fair to go around on the side? And that's kind of where this book then takes it, and which I think is a really interesting place. So I love this, and as you may be able to tell, this is probably one of my choices for the Wynne, if possible. I hope, fingers crossed, if only I were a judge. But yeah, a staggering, beautiful book, and I'm still really impressed by how much is done in 100 pages, and I'm really excited to read Permafrost by her as well. Next up, we have Whale by Cheon Myeong-Kwan, and translated from the Korean by Ji-young Kim. And this is a book that I've had so many varied opinions and thoughts on as we've gone. I struggled with parts of this as I was reading it, and then loved other parts while I was reading it. So it's one of those for me. But at the same time, I think it definitely, you know, as the comments under the video I put out about Whale showed, there are lots of people who really got on with this book and loved it. And that, to me, is a really interesting, exciting thing. I love it because I tend to like a lot of books. I tend to be fairly optimistic and like everyone wins about a lot of books. So it's quite interesting when I have a mixed feeling about a book and then other people love it, because I'm like, what am I missing? What kind of things really worked in your brain for this book? Anyway, the core idea of this book is it's essentially interconnected sort of stories or fables that all go on to tell this wider picture. And so ostensibly it talks about this, the life of sort of modern day Korea and how we got to Korea as this sort of modern day nation. And so in some ways these fables and that kind of way of approaching it is quite a fun one, because actually in modern day Korea, maybe fables are not thought of. In modern day societies, we don't maybe think of fables in quite the same way. They maybe don't have that immediacy of sort of being the first sort of source of information for many things about this. And so this book kind of talks a lot about myth making and how we create an idea of who we are as a nation, all the while having this sort of wild set of stories, that often involve some things that are quite fantastical at times. So we will, for example, vary from almost the like comically mundane of somebody making bricks, and we'll go from that to somebody talking about an extra large phallus, and we'll have a woman who talks to bees and a woman who is able to talk to elephants but also can't really talk to humans. And so just this sort of weird and wonderful kind of thing of creating this idea of who these people are, what is this society. Like, this is modern day Korea is built on maybe some of these, maybe not directly these stories, but some of the sort of national myths or kind of fairy tales, as many nations are, right? This kind of oral tradition. And so sort of taking it through to the modern day where, a myth is retold as a TV show and it corrupts all the main information about it to make it sexy. And so actually that's quite an interesting commentary on how we do stories. I will say there's a lot about the book that I struggled with. I did find parts of it a bit gratuitous. I thought parts of it were just a bit like, I was rolling my eyes a little bit at some bits. But it also seems to have really worked for people as well. So intrigued by that, even if it's not my personal favourite on this list. Next up, we have The Gospel According to the New World by Maryse Condé and translated by Richard Philcox. And I will say this is maybe the one I've struggled with most on the shortlist. And I don't want to... The reason I haven't done a solo review on this, apart from the fact I don't think I have much to say about the book, is I don't know how much value there is in me just hammering away at a book for 10 minutes that I didn't like. But for me, the core idea of this book basically is that there is a character who, the book sort of starts with this almost nativity scene style thing, and there's a rumor that they're the child of God, and the book follows through this sort of tale to kind of go through his life. I don't know what it was. The first 40 pages I read the sort of nativity scene and was really excited about where it might be going. And then for me, it sort of stalled, and I never really found that I cared. Really, it sounds awful, but is what it is. I really struggled with this book. I think for me, it sort of, I didn't really find myself engaging much with the book. And again, like with Whale, I'd be really keen to hear from somebody who did really love it. But whereas Whale seems to have this sort of, some people for whom the book really put them off, and some people who absolutely adored it. The Gospel According to the New World, I haven't seen many people really raving about. And so I'm a little confused in some ways that it's on the shortlist. And some people have sort of speculated, perhaps fairly, perhaps unfairly, that it's sort of more of a Lifetime Achievement Award because the author has said that this is her final book. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it's a surprise to me, just because I think of the six, I think, the six on the shortlist, I think 4 of them are very strong. One of them is Whale, which I think is strong in some ways, didn't fully work for me, but seems to have really engaged other people. And this one seems to be the one that nobody's really championing. And I'm kind of curious about how a book manages to not appeal to so many people and end up on a shortlist. It's sort of War of the Poor sort of gate all over again. But I think all of that sort of negativity about the book aside, I think the thing for me, it's interesting to have these new perspectives, and it's interesting that we've got an author who is really writing back against the sort of Western tradition of writing in some ways. A sort of white tradition of writing in certain ways. a kind of Caribbean author, really sort of focusing on the kind of this sort of biblical story and kind of retelling things from that side. I will say I don't think the book delivers necessarily on that. I think the idea of what the book could be for me was more exciting than what it actually ended up being. And so that's where I struggle. Because for me, I think it could have had, I feel like, I don't know if I've just missed something. I almost want to reread it to kind of see what I've missed, but I also don't fancy that idea particularly much. So there we go. On to the next book, perhaps. That's probably better. Next up, we have Standing Heavy by GauZ. And this is translated by Wynne from French. And the author himself is from the Côte d'Ivoire. And I think what's so interesting about this book, and I did a solo review of it recently, is just that it's a very short book that does a lot with narrative and perspective. So we're so used to, in many books, particularly in Europe, from having a very specific perspective of if we see minorities within a country, they are being spoken about. And I think what Standing Heavy does in a really interesting way is flips that, not only in coming from somebody themselves, but through having a security guard as the central character, we are watching the world through his eyes, and often watching how he understands sort of the sort of power relationships within the country. So he, for example, is this security guard at, in a mall, well, sort of I think it's a Sephora on the Champs-Elysees. So this big iconic French area, and this character is watching the world go by. So he's in this like really, beautiful, big, powerful area, but his eyes are trained on making sure people don't steal makeup. And he is sort of part of the system in some ways. He's there keeping an eye out for troublemakers, and those troublemakers, in many occasions, at least that he is told to look out for, will be people who to some degree look like him, who might be North African or Middle Eastern. And so he has this very strange place within that world of being, seeing people who look like him, but also those people are being criminalized while he is celebrated for doing this job. He's waiting for his French citizenship so that he can get certain benefits and get certain other sort of security, I guess, to know that he sort of belongs and is steady in this country. But equally, he watches as affluent white French people move through this store in a very, very different way. And some of the observations I thought were really biting and clever, but also very funny. I think the book, it sort of opens with this whole idea of watching a child, and children like security guards because they're sort of there, and security guards like children because, they're sort of like, well, you're probably maybe not going to steal anything. And the children are quite happy that they are not being dragged around a shop by the security guards, and all this sort of these little commentaries, which I thought were really clever and really funny. And so overall, I thought this book, again, did a lot with a short amount of space. And although not my sort of top pick for the winner, I would not be mad at all to see this win. I think it's a very clever book that has a lot to say and has a really fresh perspective. I haven't really mentioned the other two parts of the book, really, which are from different perspectives of sort of historical, sort of the 80s and I think 70s and 80s, 90s of migration to France. And particularly this sort of belief that this is going to be this golden age, that you're going to really make it. And the security guard is the modern day person showing us that that dream is not always fully realized as well, which I think is really interesting. Next up, we have Time Shelter by Georgi Gospodinov, translated from the Bulgarian by Angela Rodel. And I really loved this. I read it a bit before the Longlist came out, kind of anticipating that it might make the list. And I just absolutely loved the way this book approaches things. So the core idea is that we're thinking a lot about memory and myth making for nations. And so there's a lot around this sort of clinic that is aiming to take these clients back into their memories to think about this sort of golden age. And there's a really brilliant bit of, I think, sort of quite clever satirizing of this towards the end of the book, and this isn't a spoiler, where nations are voting on which time period to return to. And the way the book handles it, I think, is incredibly clever for challenging this very idea that there is ever a golden age where everything's perfect for everybody within a nation. There are times where a nation is richer and is having more success, but at that same time, the nation might be that wealth might only be going to certain people in society, or there might be wider social issues that are not being addressed. So, for example, Britain in this is looking at the sort of 80s and sort of Thatcherism, and it's looking at potentially the sort of big amount of wealth for certain people, but then there's also these big periods of social unrest. So Britain thinks, well, what about these other time periods? And all of these things kind of come into it, of this wider discussion of what would it has there ever been a golden age for any society where everybody is really well affected by it and it's the best time for everybody? And equally, if you do that, but your neighbor in another country is in a different time period because that was a better time for them, what does that mean for your relationships? What does 1970s or 80s Britain do alongside 1990s Sweden, for example? So yeah, I think this book does that side really, really cleverly. But I think it's also really fun in terms of being playing with the form of a novel. So, well, not even the form necessarily, but playing with this idea of time. So at the beginning of the book, before the book even begins, we have a set of sort of epigrams and quotes. And those quotes, some of the time, are from the character Gospodin, who we then meet in the book. So Gospodin is sort of jumping back in time to before this book, to say these things which are sometimes attributed to Gospodin and somebody else, like Shakespeare and Gospodin, or are sometimes just attributed to only Gospodin. And so these characters, the character is sort of alive beyond those pages of the book. They've kind of infiltrated other parts, which sort of adds to this idea that actually Gospodin's time travel is real. And I like the way that the book really played with it. And so for me, that sort of started to really sell me on what this book is aiming for. And I think is a very, very strong contender. I would love to see this win. I think it's a very, very strong book. And last but absolutely not least, probably my favourite from the entire list, Stillborn by Guadalupe Nettel, translated from the Spanish by Rosalind Harvey. And I adored this. I read it fairly early on in terms of the Longlist. It was one of the first of the Longlist I read. And it stuck with me. I think it's a brilliant book that does so much. It kind of, in terms of the big theme of the Longlist, it talks a lot about motherhood, as the title might also suggest. But the core idea is that there are two women who are sort of long-term friends, and one of them starts trying for a baby and has various complications. There's sort of some health issues for the child. There's a whole discussion about the ethics of giving birth to a child who might have a really complicated and difficult life in terms of their health, what that means for the parents who may or may not be able to look after them effectively. And all of this is alongside her friend, who is who we hear most of the book through. Her friend does not want children at all. And so these two women have very, very different perspectives of this. But I think the thing I said in the individual review for this book that I really appreciated is both these characters are given time to explore wider things about who they are. So it's not just, hi, I'm character A, I'm against having kids. I'm character B, I really want to have kids. It's not that kind of clear cipher kind of thing of you are merely a cipher, you're just a set of ideas boiled down into a character. People have these really complicated approaches to things. Humans are messy and humans are these complicated beings. And so, our main narrator through this book, she doesn't want kids, but she equally starts to look after a child who lives nearby, like her neighbor's child. She also sees these pigeons out on the kind of the balcony and wants to look after them, these little pigeon eggs. And so she sort of also has this sort of complication of, well, here's me supporting life and supporting children who are already in the world. I just don't want that for myself. And I think it really explores the complicated mess that can come up in terms of those, thinking about those ethics and desires and all of these other things. But also at the heart of it, it's just a really bloody good book. I think I loved the writing of this. I thought it was so evocative and expressive and powerful, and punchy, and you know, it's relatively short chapters, but also I just found myself really burning through this book. I was just completely captivated by the world it creates and the way it's written. There's a real sort of forcefulness to the writing that's never too much for me, at least. It always felt like it was just this very expressive, rich world, and I loved it for that. So this would be my top choice. So if it hasn't been made clear already from all of this, I have some favourites in mind, and for me, Stillborn is probably my top choice. I'd love to see Time Shelter or Boulder also take the prize. Would not be mad at Standing Heavy or really Whale, which I realise leaves one exception. But, you know, Whale, as much as I didn't personally get on with it fully, I think it is one of those things that's really appealed to some people. So I get that there's something exciting going on there. Standing Heavy, I think, does really interesting things with perspective. So yeah, Time Shelter, Stillborn and Boulder are my top three. Whale and Standing Heavy, I feel fairly happy about the idea of them winning. And I guess that only leaves the one, Gospel According to the New World, that I would be really quite surprised, if nothing else, to see win, particularly as I haven't seen many people championing it. But I think overall, just, yeah, a really interesting shortlist. Even if, again, a shortlist that I was not expecting from the Longlist. So this has been a year full of surprises, but I hope that when the winner is announced fairly soon, I hope, either way, I hope you check that book out, you check out this shortlist and the Longlist, which I think is really full of some fantastic books, and take care from there. So I've been Bob the Booker, talking about this year's International Booker. I hope you have a great time. I hope you really enjoy this list. I'd love to know your favourites. If you've got top picks that you'd really love to see win, let me know, and take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.